What lies behind disparity? The idea that all ethnic minority people suffer a common fate and a shared disadvantage is an anachronism. Yet both the reality and the perception of unfairness matter. The nationwide BLM marches last year were catalysed by a shocking case of police brutality in the USA that resulted in the death of George Floyd. Many British citizens, particularly young adults, felt compelled to protest and call for changes here too. The countries are different and face different race-related challenges. But in some places in the UK, especially in black inner-city communities, historical wrongdoings by the state and police have left a deep legacy of mistrust too. We understand the idealism of those well-intentioned young people who have held on to and amplified this intergenerational mistrust. However, we also have to ask whether a narrative that claims nothing has changed for the better and that the dominant feature of our society is institutional racism and white privilege will achieve anything beyond alienating the decent centre ground, a centre ground which is occupied by people of all races and ethnicities. What lies behind disparity is a key question to answer. We recognise the lived realities and sometimes trauma of racial disadvantage. Our thinking also looks hard at the evidence and the multiple causes in play, and seeks to come up with relevant measures, for example, to deal with the disproportionate effect of our Class B drug laws on young black people, or problems in mental health provisions for those of ethnic minority groups that struggle to access services when they need them. This commission finds that the big challenge of our age is not overt racial prejudice. It is building on and advancing the progress won by the struggles of the past 50 years. This requires us to take a broader, dispassionate look at what has been holding some people back. We therefore cannot accept the accusatory tone of much of the current rhetoric on race, and the pessimism about what has been and what more can be achieved. The more recent instances where ethnic minority communities have rightly felt let down, such as the Grenfell tragedy or the Windrush scandal, sparked genuine national grief over the traumatic loss of lives and the widespread anger and remorse over the mistreatment of fellow citizens. Likewise, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on some ethnic minority groups is partly explained by the prevalence of ethnic minorities who work on the front line and provide unpaid care in multi-generational households. Outcomes such as these do not come about by design, and are certainly not deliberately targeted. But when they do occur, every step needs to be taken to ensure that the reasons why they happened are understood fully, and the causes then acted on to ensure that they are not repeated. Open Britain. This report is not just a report card on how badly or how well the UK has served its ethnic minorities. It is underpinned by an ideal for a modern UK best encapsulated by what we saw in the opening ceremony of the London 2012 Olympics. We saw an array of people and cultures from the sleepy English countryside to the frenetic music of the inner city. It not only featured British icons like James Bond and the monarchy, there was also a joyful expression of the contribution made by the Windrush generation, as well as the working-class contribution to the country's history and industrial might. One highlight was Dizzy Rascal belting out his hit Bonkers. Danny Boyle managed to create a vision of the UK which united all communities. He gave us an ideal of an open, optimistic UK, refreshed with new communities. On that day, the whole nation was proud to be British. But the Commission has also been keen to understand what happened when everyone went home after the Games ended. Did the UK return to its separate worlds, where we lived parallel lives? A world where your talent and potential contribution are limited by which postcode you live in, your race, or your socio-economic background. We recognise that building a confident, successful, multi-ethnic society is a huge and difficult endeavour. It is not an end in itself, but it is a way to strengthen the whole team. When the current reality changes, so too must our approach. All the data tells us that the UK is far more open to minority advancement than 50 years ago. And while some doors at the top remain hard to lever open, People with some minority backgrounds are successfully taking up opportunities. In fact, as of 2019, the ethnicity pay gap, taking the median hourly earnings of all ethnic minority groups and the white group, is down to just 2.3%, and the white Irish, Chinese and Indian ethnic groups are, on average, earning notably more than the white British average. Professor Yao-Yun Lee undertook bespoke research for the Commission on the ethnic minority social mobility. Going back 50 years, he found while many groups experienced a first-generation downward mobility, the second generation have been making rapid progress and have caught up with, and in some cases, surpassed white people. Additionally, there is no evidence of the blocking of ethnic minority advancement into professional managerial positions in Britain, as was the case in the United States of America in the 1960s against the African Americans. Much of this advance has only happened in the past 2 or 3 decades, and the story remains imperfect and mixed. Until COVID-19 struck, the vast majority of people aged under 25 from all ethnic backgrounds were in permanent employment, although those from minority groups were more likely to be unemployed and on 0-hours contracts. Additionally, it is clear that job opportunities and labour market conditions vary based on where you are in the UK. One advantage that ethnic minorities have is that they are disproportionately based in London. Around 40% of the UK's ethnic minority population live in London, compared with just 9% of the white British population, and this mitigates the country's significant challenges with regional inequality. There is one reason why we believe it important to look beyond race to other causes of disadvantage, even when considering issues of race and ethnicity. The life chances of the child of a Harrow-raised British Indian accountant and the child of a Bradford-raised British Pakistani taxi driver are as wide apart as they are, partly because of the UK's economic geography. Meanwhile, the numerically largest disadvantaged group is low-income white boys, especially those from former industrial or coastal towns who are failing at secondary school and are the people least likely to go to university. Unlike many other reports on race and ethnicity, we've included the white group in our deliberations. For a range of outcomes, white working-class children trail behind their peers in almost all ethnic minority groups, although the extent of these disparities vary by area. Perceptions and reality. Overt and outright racism persists in the UK. Examples of it loom larger in our minds because we witness it not just as graffiti on our walls or abuse hurled across our streets, but also in the more private setting of our phones and tablets. The rise of social media platforms mean racist incidents can go viral in hours. What is too often dismissed as trolling means many prominent ethnic minority people routinely receive racist abuse from people who cannot be traced and held to account. Making anonymous abuse harder online is a complex issue, but should be a public policy priority. Speech resonates long after it's heard. Being made to feel that you do not belong, that no matter how patriotic, law-abiding and hard-working you are, you can be treated differently because of your skin colour, stands against everything this country holds dear. A multi-ethnic democracy like ours cannot function properly if people can denigrate their fellow citizens in such a deplorable term on the ground of race. One of the most concerning side effects of social media is that it enormously amplifies racist views and online commentary. Almost every day the newspapers report racist abuse of celebrities, and polling by the British Future think tank for the Commission finds that while 13% of white people say they have been subject to racist or prejudiced insults on social media, the figure rises to 19% for people from the Pakistani ethnic group and 22% for black people. The gravitational force of dominant narratives tends to point our attention in negative directions, such as racist abuse on social media, and away from positive ones. The fact, for example, that 40% of the NHS consultants are from ethnic minorities. And too much of the public debate is ill-informed or uninformed, hate crime being an example. It is widely believed that hate crime is worsening. Some argue that it is because of Brexit, others that it is exasperated by the prevalence and visibility of racism online. Every case is unacceptable, and a body blow struck against a decent society, especially the small proportion of cases involving physical violence. But police-recorded hate crime figures are rising because of improved police recording processes and a greater awareness of what constitutes a hate crime. The total of police-recorded race-related hate crime for England and Wales has leapt up in recent years, increasing by 131% in the 9 years to March 2020. By contrast, responses to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, CSEW, which is considered more reliable than police-recorded crime, showed that the number of racially motivated hate crimes reduced from 149,000 in the years ending March 2010 to March 2012 to 104,000 in the years ending March 2018 to March 2020. This is still far too many incidents, and the trends are subject to change, but it does suggest that hate crime, like racist attitudes, is on the decline. Another example of overly pessimistic narratives, heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic, has been on race and health. The increased age-adjusted risk of death for COVID-19 in Black and South Asian groups was widely being reported as being due to racism and as exasperating existing health inequalities. However, many analyses have shown that the increased risk of dying from COVID-19 is mainly due to an increased risk of exposure to infection. This is attributed to the fact that Black and South Asian people are more likely to live in urban areas with higher population density and levels of deprivation, work in higher risk occupations such as healthcare or transport, and to live with older relatives who themselves are at higher risk due to their age or having other comorbidities such as diabetes and obesity. Also, if it were true that Black and South Asian groups were suffering from systemic racism throughout their lives, adversely affecting their health, education, income, housing, employment, the key determinants of health, this would be reflected in overall mortality figures across life course. In fact, Black and Asian groups have had lower mortality rates from all causes, and data for Scotland suggest Asian ethnic groups have higher life expectancy than white ethnic groups. This is particularly surprising, as ethnic minority groups are more likely to live in the most overall deprived neighbourhoods in England. Even over the course of the pandemic, despite the higher COVID-19 death rates, overall mortality in Black and South Asian groups has not been higher than for white groups. So, instead of focusing solely on race and ethnicity, we need to consider the key underlying risk factors, which are mainly socio-economic, that are causing the higher death rates, and which will therefore reduce the risk of death in all ethnic groups, including white groups. The Commission has also been particularly concerned to understand how it is that, as outcomes have been improving for ethnic minority groups and majority attitudes have become increasingly open-minded, that a more fatalistic narrative, which claims that nothing has really changed, seems to have gripped the popular perception. Sundar Katwala, the head of the British Future think tank, says that Britain is doing much better on race than on class. The reason why this does not seem more apparent is because there is now a split between academic, media and political environments and the lived experience of the rest of the country. The problem is that the race discourse is dominated by people who spend all their time on it. We don't hear enough from people who just get on with their everyday lives and are not defined by race. However, he also notes that many disadvantaged Black and Muslim groups do feel defined by their race, whereas fewer middle-class professionals from Indian and Chinese ethnic groups feel the same. We suggest that pessimistic narratives about race have also been reinforced by a rise of identity politics, as old class divisions have lost traction. Well-organised, single-issue identity lobby groups also help to raise the volume. These organisations can do good work protecting the vulnerable, but they also tend to have a pessimism bias in their narratives to draw attention to their cause, and they tend to stress the lived experience of the groups they seek to protect with less emphasis on objective data. It is not surprising, therefore, that mainstream public debate about race sensitizes minorities to discrimination, but does less to highlight minority self-reliance and resilience. Immigrant optimism. We commissioned new research from the University of Oxford that explores the range of factors that combine to influence educational outcomes in ethnic groups. These factors include sex, ethnicity, and socio-economic status. Our analyses define socio-economic status as parental education, occupation, and family income. It is the Commission's belief that educational success should be celebrated, replicated, and used as an exemplar to inspire all pupils across the UK. Evidence shows that certain ethnic groups, such as Black African, Indian, and Bangladeshi pupils, perform better than white British groups once socio-economic status is taken into consideration. This outstanding performance is in part due to what is termed immigrant optimism, a phenomenon where recent immigrants devote themselves more to education than the native population because they lack financial capital and see education as a way out of poverty. In practice, this means there are significant factors at play that can help groups overcome their socio-economic status and succeed. Research by the Centre of Longitudinal Studies and the Runnymede Trust also finds higher aspirations amongst ethnic minority children at 14 years old compared with white children. White boys gave themselves an average probability of going to university of 60.9%, while for white girls the estimation was higher at 68.3%. This compared starkly with the Black African boys, 81.7%, and girls 88.8%. Indian, 81.3% and 85.3%. Pakistani, 74.9% and 82.4%. And Bangladeshi, 77.8% and 80.2%. Black Caribbean boys were the only group with lower expectations than the white boys group at 58.5%, while Black Caribbean girls gave them a 73.3% probability of going to university. There are conflicting views on what drives immigrant optimism, whether it is an internal drive or a response to external discrimination. However, it is evident that ethnic minority groups have agency to overcome obstacles and achieve success. Why BAME doesn't work. The use of the term BAME, which is frequently used to group all ethnic minorities together, is no longer helpful. It is demeaning to be categorized in relation to what we are not rather than what we are: British Indian, British Caribbean, and so on. The BAME acronym also disguises huge differences in outcomes between ethnic groups. This reductionist idea forces us to think that the principal cause of all disparities must be majority versus minority discrimination. It also allows our institutions and businesses to point to the success of some BAME people in their organisation and absolve themselves of responsibility for people from those minority groups that are doing less well. Like the UK's white population, ethnic minority groups are far from monolithic in their attitudes towards British social norms and their inclusion in different walks of life. It is time we dropped the term and talked about people from particular ethnic backgrounds, and if we do sometimes need to distinguish between all white and non-white populations, we should use the term ethnic minority, ethnic group, or white ethnic minorities, where appropriate, which we have used throughout this report, wherefore the data enables us to do so. Indeed, the use of white as a standard term is as unhelpful as other aggregated labels, as it masks the diversity of groups within, such as white Irish, Gypsy, Roma, and travellers and Eastern Europeans, and the unique experiences and outcomes that they also face. British Future has looked at the language of race and whether people felt as we do, that an aggregate term like BAME has outlived its usefulness. There was no clear majority amongst either white or ethnic minority respondents for preserving BAME. Among ethnic minorities, 40% said it was still useful, 36% said it was out of date, and 25% didn't know. The term ethnic minority was more popular amongst ethnic minority respondents than either BAME or people of colour. Recognition of the differences between groups requires a new and more granular approach to data and how it's collected and used. Too much data continues to be collected at the level of the 5 big ethnic classifications: white, black, Asian, mixed, and other, which in some instances merges together ethnic groups with vastly different experiences and outcomes. We also need more sensitivity to differences within social or ethnic groups, such as urban middle-class Gujaratis versus rural Mirpuri, which are arguably bigger than most differences between ethnic groups. There is also an urgent need for individual-level data and analysis that accounts for the many factors that come together to influence outcomes, such as age, class, and region. The government's new Equality Hub data project, announced in December 2020, should ensure that this new multivariable approach becomes the standard for collecting and presenting data in a nuanced way. The language of race. The public debate on race is sometimes hampered by the fact that there is no consensus on the meaning of even fundamental words, like racism and discrimination. The word racism can apply to such a wide range of human behavior, and from the stereotyping of a stranger to the horror of genocide. It is used so differently in debate that people often argue at cross purposes. We have sought to examine the practical causes of undesirable disparities between groups and put forward how to narrow them. However, we have also looked at the way disparities are discussed in mainstream discourse, and have been concerned with the use of imprecise and often misleading language around race and racism. The linguistic inflation on racism is confusing, and prefixes like institutional, structural, and systemic adding to the problem. It is a sad reality that racism still exists in every country, and we cannot afford for the term to become misunderstood or trivialized. In the call for evidence, the Commission noted a tendency to conflate discrimination and disparities. While they sometimes coexist, they often do not. The Commission believes that this is symptomatic of a wider repeated use and misapplication of the term racism to account for every observed disparity. This matters because the more things are explained as a result of racial bias, the more it appears that society is set against ethnic minorities, which in turn can discourage ethnic minority individuals from pursuing their goals. If more precise language does not become a feature of our national conversation on race, we can expect to see tensions increase across the communities, despite determined action by government and civil society to reduce discrimination. The Commission was especially concerned with the way the term institutional racism is being applied in current discourse on racial disparities. We noted the evolving definitions of institutional racism during the 18 years between the Scarman Report in 1981 and the Macpherson Report of 1999. The late Sir William Macpherson gave the following definition, which we believe has stood the test of time. Quote, "The collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people." End quote. One of the key justifications for the Macpherson Report's finding of institutional racism was the underreporting of racist crime, now known as hate crime, reflecting a lack of trust in the police on the part of ethnic minorities. The term described a set of practices and behaviours that were commonplace, sanctioned by authorities, and which unduly harmed ethnic minority groups, even if unintentionally. That is largely no longer the case, given that reporting hate crime and race-related incidents is now widely encouraged by police forces. The term is now being liberally used and often to describe any circumstance in which there are differences in outcomes between racial and ethnic groups which exist in an institution, without evidence to support such claims. The Commission therefore feels that misapplying the term racism has diluted its credibility, and thus undermined the seriousness of racism, where it does exist in contemporary Britain. Where institutional racism is used too casually as an explanatory tool, it can also lead to insufficient consideration of other factors, which are also known to drive such differences in outcomes. If accusations of institutional racism are levelled against institutions, these should, like any other serious accusation, be subject to robust assessment and evidence, and show that an institution has treated an ethnic group differently to other groups because of their ethnic identity. What might such evidence look like? Imagine a world with just two groups in which both are equally prejudiced, but the minority forms just 10% of the population. When it comes to hiring, the potential prejudice faced by a minority applicant will be much greater than the potential prejudice against an applicant from the majority. But this structural imbalance is measured through using surveys of individual prejudice and tests of aggregate prejudices, such as curriculum vitae studies. Another example could be one in which most members of an institution are not personally prejudiced, but feel social pressure to act in such a manner towards the minority, because they believe that most others are prejudiced and their workplace expects them to discriminate. Again, surveys can assess the extent to which beliefs about such expectations exist. In the last 30 years, attitudes towards racism and hate crimes have changed dramatically, and there is a much greater awareness and willingness to record and monitor such incidents by the authorities. Yet, the advent of social media seems to have partly undermined this apparent march of progress. The spread of mobile phone use, and social media in particular, has allowed the proliferation of most negative messages and attitudes. There are hundreds of millions of tweets sent every day. Less frequent occurrences in the offline world can happen numerous times a day online. This amplifies the toxic messages of a small number of hardcore racists far beyond any sort of audience they would ever have had in the past, and is likely contributing to the fear that racism is increasing, despite evidence to the contrary. We return to this issue in more detail in the Crime and Policing chapter. Just as racist behaviour and racist messages are being amplified, so are the accusations of racism that are harder to prove, open to interpretation, or even vexatious. The Internet has also exposed the problems inherent in a subjective definition of a racist incident. We can have a situation where the exact same action can be racism or not racism, depending on how someone perceives it. This means there is no clarity or consistency in identifying examples. It is now possible for any act, including those intended to be well-meaning, to be classified as racist. Without clearer definitions, it will be harder to measure the true extent of racism. Perceptions matter. As we've seen in policing, trust has to be earned and reciprocated, and this means being seen to be fair as well as having fair processes. To limit the widening charge of racism and further dilution of its importance, we suggest assessing the intent of the perpetrator as well as the perception of the victim. Victims' voices must be heard. However, to secure the justice they deserve for pain caused and suffered, the racists responsible need to be unequivocally identified and exposed. To aid this, we also need clear definitional standards of the terms of institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. Right now, they are used interchangeably, which creates further confusion and reduces the likelihood of perpetrators being caught and punished. References to systemic, institutional, or structural racism may relate to specific processes which can be identified, but they can also relate to the feeling described by many ethnic minorities of not belonging. There is certainly a class of actions, behaviours, and incidents at organisational level which cause ethnic minorities to lack a sense of belonging. This is often informally expressed as feeling othered. However, as with hate incidents, this can have a highly subjective dimension for those tasked with investigating the claim. It is very difficult to measure the extent to which an organisation's culture is inclusive or biased, but we feel it is important to shift discussions about systemic or structural racism onto more objective foundations. Rooting these terms in observable metrics gives us the chance to not only measure how people feel, but also analyse both the causes and where things are getting better. Institutions need to also acknowledge improvements and to use both quantitative and qualitative evidence transparently to show a fuller picture. Terms like structural racism have roots in a critique of capitalism, which states that racism is inextricably linked to capitalism. So by that definition, until the system is abolished, racism will flourish. Many are using structural racism to mean deep-seated exclusion rather than the tearing down of capitalism. These are issues that can only be partly addressed by the government, and will need cooperation in particular from business, the media, civil society and other non-state actors who influence the way in which we discuss race. The Commission, therefore, proposes the following framework to distinguish between different forms of racial disparity and racism. 1. Explained racial disparities. This term should be used when there are persistent ethnic differential outcomes that can demonstrably be shown to be the result of other factors, such as geography, class, or sex. 2. Unexplained racial disparities. Persistent differential outcomes for ethnic groups with no conclusive evidence about the causes. This applies to situations where a disparate outcome is identified, but there is no evidence as to what is causing it. 3. Institutional racism. Applicable to an institution that is racist, or discriminatory processes, policies, attitudes, or behaviours in a single institution. 4. Systemic racism. This applies to interconnected organisations or wider society, which exhibit racist or discriminatory processes, policies, or attitudes or behaviours. 5. Structural racism. To describe a legacy of historic racist or discriminatory processes, policies, attitudes, or behaviours that continue to shape organisations and societies today. Another term that is highly controversial and contested is white privilege. This phrase, coined in the USA, is undoubtedly alienating to those who do not feel especially privileged by their skin colour. Phrases like white privilege and white fragility imply that it is white people's attitudes and behaviours that primarily cause the disadvantage experienced by ethnic minorities. It also reinforces the perception that being an ethnic minority in the UK is to be treated unfairly by default. The evidence we have studied does not support this. The Commission rejects the approach, believes it fails to identify the real causes for disparities, and that it is counterproductive and divisive. There is something, however, in the idea that even in a relatively open society like today's UK, a psychological comfort can be derived from looking like the majority of people around you. A better term, which usefully captures the tendency for groups to favour their own, is the concept of affinity bias. Racism is not just about words. Bias, bigotry, and unfairness based on race may be receding, but they still have power to deny opportunity and painfully disrupt lives. If we are to build trust in institutions and organisations, we must be willing to investigate evidence of racism and be prepared as a society to root it out. This means using all the levers at our disposal. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC, is charged with investigating breaches of the Equality Act, and it is important that it has the resources to do so. Recommendation 1. Build trust, challenge racist and discriminatory actions. The Commission recommends that, to aid endeavours to drive out race-based discrimination and prejudice, the EHRC receives additional ring-fenced funding from the government to use their compliance, enforcement and litigation powers to challenge policies or practices that either cause significant and unjust racial disadvantage or arise from racial discrimination. Separately, government should consider the complex issue of online abuse and the platforms that are used to perpetuate such as a public policy priority. Geography, class, and ethnicity. The UK suffers from acute geographical inequality. That is hardly news. But the scale of the gulf in opportunity is seldom appreciated. According to Professor Philip McCann of Sheffield University, about half the population in the UK live in areas where prosperity is no better than the poorest parts of old East Germany or the poorest states in the USA, like Mississippi or West Virginia. For 30 years, says McCann, the country has been decoupling. London and the South East, plus pockets of affluence and dynamism elsewhere, have been pulling away from the rest. The core cities outside London, with the exception of Bristol, have been underperforming, but it is the ex-industrial and mining areas and towns on the coastal periphery which are the poorest and least productive places. Towns like Barnsley in South Yorkshire, Dudley in the West Midlands, Middlesbrough in the North East, or Blackburn in the North West. In simple numerical terms, this is overwhelmingly a white British problem, but it is also the case that ethnic minority Britons are more likely to live in persistent poverty and overwhelmed housing. Geographical inequalities also afflict a significant section of the South Asian population, who live in the former mill towns and ex-industrial Midlands. The most concentrated pockets of deprivation are found amongst ethnic minority groups, particularly Pakistani, Bangladeshi and black groups, and in many aspects related to quality of life, ethnic minorities, particularly amongst the latter groups, are placed below the white British group, due in part to the lack of a substantial affluent group for these minorities. However, it is the poorer white people outside London who are the largest group to be found in areas with multidimensional disadvantages, from income to longevity of life. The English region with the worst life expectancy is one of the whitest, the North East, and the number of years people can expect to live in good health is generally lower in the northern parts of England compared with the south. The most recent index of multiple deprivation for England finds that local authorities with the highest number of deprived neighbourhoods are all in the north: Middlesbrough, Liverpool, Knowsley, Hull and Manchester. All except Manchester have a disproportionate representation of white British population. The proportion of deprived neighbourhoods in London is falling. The overall percentage of white British people living in the 10% of most deprived neighbourhoods is 9.1%, which is disproportionately low and below several groups, most notably Pakistani, 31.1%, Bangladeshi, 19.3%. Mixed white and black Caribbean, 17.4%, and black African, 15.6%. But it is also worth noting that the white British percentage translates into nearly 4 million people. The Pakistani ethnic group is the next highest group, with 346,000 in absolute numbers. There is a sense of stagnation about the fate and life chances of poorer white groups, which is less the case with ethnic minority groups. Until the recent focus on the left-behind towns and levelling up, there was no national narrative encouraging the advancement for this group in the way there has been for ethnic minorities. White children on free school meals lag behind every other group in Progress 8 attainment levels at secondary school. They are also least likely to progress to university. Poor white groups, and especially poor white boys, do badly in the education system everywhere, whereas in some areas at least, especially London, poor ethnic minorities are improving rapidly. The Social Mobility Commission has a Social Mobility Index which looks at education attainment from primary level to university for those from poor backgrounds, and then adds in adult opportunity in terms of incomes, availability of professional jobs, prevalence of low pay, and so on. Nearly 70% of all the social mobility hotspot success stories are in London and the South East. There are none in the North East, Yorkshire and Humber and the West Midlands. The top 65 worst-performing local authority areas are almost all overwhelmingly white British places. Of the worst-performing local authorities, Nottingham at 15, Oldham at 31, Bradford at 48 and Wolverhampton at 62 are the only local authorities with significant ethnic minority populations. It is a similar story with the Income Deprivation Affecting Children Index, the IDACI score. The worst 5 areas of IDACI scores are around 30%, are all overwhelmingly white British places: Middlesbrough, Blackpool, Knowsley, Liverpool and Hull. And in those areas further down the list with significant ethnic minority populations, the minority performance on Progress 8 attainment is in almost all cases far ahead of white British. The figures on Progress 8 educational advancement are startling, and underline the significant divergence between the poor white British and poor ethnic minorities. Poor white people score between minus 0.6 and minus 0.8 in each of the 9 major regions of England. For ethnic minorities, only one region, the southwest, is slightly worse than minus 0.4. Most other regions are only just in the minus, apart from London, which is plus 0.2. The opportunity areas, announced by the Department for Education, combined the Social Mobility Index with the department's own Achieving Excellence areas, aimed at those places with underperforming schools. 12 locations came up which are, with the exception of Oldham and Bradford, overwhelmingly white places. West Somerset, Norwich, Blackpool, North Yorkshire Coast, Derby, Oldham, Fenland and East Cambridgeshire, Hastings, Bradford, Stoke-on-Trent, Doncaster, Ipswich. When considering this data and noting the profound disparities that it highlighted, the Commission was even more firmly of the view that its recommendations should focus on improving outcomes for all, not centre on specific ethnic groups alone. Ethnicity wealth gap and home ownership. People from ethnic minority backgrounds are more likely to live in households with persistent low income, after housing costs. 28% of people in black households were on persistent low income, the highest of all groups compared with 25% of Asian households and 12% of white households. Aside from that disproportionate representation of minorities amongst those on persistent low incomes, the income story has been largely a progressive one in recent decades, with movement towards or even overtaking of the white British median. It is a less encouraging story with wealth and property ownership, but one would expect wealth accumulation to take longer in generational time. According to an ONS survey, 2016 to 2018, median total wealth for all households was £286,000, with medians ranging from £34,000 for households with a black African head to £314,000 for the white British group, with the Indian ethnic group close behind. Unlike on the earned income spectrum, Pakistani households do well on household wealth at just over £200,000, while the Chinese ethnic group, despite being high-income earners, lags behind all major ethnic groups on household wealth, apart from the Bangladeshi and black African groups. In the UK, property is the main but not the only source of wealth. Households with an Indian Pakistani or white British head had the highest net property wealth, taking into account how much of a property is owned or still covered by a mortgage, with medians of £176,000, £115,000 and £115,000 respectively. A total of 63% of all households own their own home, with significantly more than 2/3 of white British households being home owners, compared with 2/5 for all other ethnic groups. There is a significant difference between ethnic minority groups, with the Indian ethnic group way out in front at 74%, with mixed white and Asian on 70%, and white British on 68%. Black Caribbean households have double the rate of home ownership as black African households, at 40% compared with 20%, reflecting their longer history in the UK. Pakistani households have a rate of 58%, way ahead of Bangladeshi households on 46%, and Chinese households on 45%, which partly explains the latter group's lowly rating on median wealth. White British households are less likely to rent either privately or from a social landlord than all other households. 16% of them rent from a social landlord, compared with 22% of all other households, and a further 16% rented from a private landlord compared with 37% of others. Overcrowding, which reflects both family sizes as well as nature and affordability of the local housing stock, was more common amongst ethnic minority households in general. Overcrowding affected 30% of Bangladeshi households in the year to March 2016, 16% of black African and 7% of black Caribbean, compared with just 2% of white British households. However, white British households made up almost half of the 660,000 overcrowded households in England. Compared with all other regions, London had the highest rates of overcrowding, 13% of ethnic minority households, and 3% of white British households. People in the most deprived neighbourhoods tend to be disadvantaged across multiple aspects of life. Pakistani and Bangladeshi people were overrepresented in the most deprived neighbourhoods in England. 31%, or around 346,000 of the Pakistani population, and 28%, or around 113,000 of the Bangladeshi population, lived in the most deprived 10% of neighbourhoods in England. All the black ethnic groups were also disproportionately likely to live in the most deprived neighbourhoods. Only Indian, white British, white Irish, Chinese and other ethnic groups were not disproportionately likely in these most deprived neighbourhoods. 1/4 of Bangladeshi households' income came from benefits and tax credits, excluding the state pension, as did 18% of Pakistani and 17% of black people's incomes. These were larger proportions than for other ethnic groups. Over half of households in these ethnic groups were in receipt of state support, particularly child tax credit. Chinese people were the least likely to be in receipt of state support, with just 3 in 10 claiming any. Cultural traditions, family and integration. If it is possible to have racial disadvantage without racists, then we need to look elsewhere for the roots of that disadvantage. Racial disadvantage often overlaps with social class disadvantage. But how have some groups transcended that disadvantage, and more swiftly than others? There has been a revolution over the last half-century in the family structure. Much of this has been welcome. More accepting attitudes towards divorce, and more autonomy for women has increased human freedom, and we know that many variations beyond the traditional nuclear family can work. However, as these freedoms have grown, there is also greater stress on families, and the prevalence of breakdown has increased. The Commission is not passing judgment about how people live their lives, nor is it saying 2 parents are always better than 1. Lone parent families may face greater strain, but if they have the right resources and support available, they can provide just as good a start in life. The support, nurture and care that family networks provide are something that no government intervention can match in practical or emotional power. But the need for support is inevitably greater amongst lone parent families. In those ethnic minority groups where family breakdown is more prevalent, the need for support from either extended family or community groups is even greater. During the course of its work, the Commission noted with great concern the prevalence of family breakdown. In 2020, 14.7% of families in the UK were lone parent families, 2.9 million. 63% of black Caribbean children were growing up in lone parent families, as were 62% of children in the black other ethnic group. High instances of lone parenthood were also experienced by mixed ethnicity black children. Black African people have a lower rate of single parenthood, but at 43% are still well above the average. South Asian and Chinese ethnic groups are much lower than other groups, with the Indian ethnic group the lowest at just 6%. Lone parent families have become more common since the 1970s, a result of an increase in divorces as well as an increase in never-married lone mothers. There may be a number of underlying reasons for this: cultural change relating to male responsibility, the welfare state, and growing affluence making it possible to bring up children alone. The lower rate of family breakdown amongst Asian families is notable, pointing to different cultural values or expectations. The academic Dr. Rakib Eshan wrote on his own upbringing, quote, "Many of Britain's South Asian communities, at varying degrees of affluence, are deeply family-oriented and intergenerationally cohesive. Civic associations with such communities continue to flourish, with places of worship providing a spiritually uplifting sense of belonging. Whether it was the local newsagents or the Asian greengrocers, my community elders would take an interest in how I was performing at school, college, and university. Not only does this make a young person feel valued, it provides a healthy pressure where one does not want to disappoint one's own parents, but also wishes to avoid potential embarrassment in the wider local community. personal pride and family honour are important in this context." End quote. It should be pointed out that differences in socio-economic status between groups complicate the picture, with high rates of family breakdown found amongst poor white people too. For families with children of all ethnicities, only 45% of those in the bottom income quintile are married compared with 84% in the top quintile, according to the Centre for Social Justice, the CSJ. There is a wealth of evidence from the academic literature pointing to a greater likelihood of negative outcomes tied to family breakdown, although these are largely focused on the USA. A study in the USA by Sarah McClanahan et al. 2013 was able to show that father absence was tied to children's worse educational performance, emotional development, and adult mental health. Research has also linked father's absence to increased likelihood of youth incarceration, although this could in part be attributed to poverty. Research from the CSJ shows that children who experience family breakdown are more likely to underperform at school. This family strain manifests itself as adverse effects on communication, parenting, and struggles with special needs. The strain of parental breakup and may go on to leave a negative impact on a child's emotional and social competence. To repeat, this is not about allocating blame, but simply pointing out that children require both time and resources, and that it is more likely to be available when both parents play active roles in their upbringings. Governments cannot remain neutral here. We would urge the government to investigate this issue further and look at initiatives that prevent family breakdown. Another area where cultural traditions may play an important role is in attitudes to integration and mixing with other ethnic groups. Baroness Casey's Review into Opportunity and Integration, 2016, looked at issues of integration and segregation, particularly through the lens of gender and language. Here she confronted some uncomfortable truths about behaviour and attitudes among some ethnic minority groups that actively hold back integration, a theme first raised by Trevor Phillips in his lecture Sleepwalking into Segregation in 2005. Casey noted that more than half of women in the Pakistani and Bangladeshi ethnic groups are economically inactive, compared with a quarter of white women. This helps explain why Pakistani and Bangladeshi families are disproportionately represented in lower income deciles. The race disparity audit also revealed that in England, adults from a Bangladeshi and Pakistani background were the most likely not to speak English well or at all. Among 45 to 64-year-olds, 17.4% of Bangladeshi women and 9% of Pakistani women were unable to speak English at the 2011 census. This clearly is an obstacle to economic advance and broader integration. One reason for this issue being most pronounced amongst people from Pakistani and Bangladeshi ethnic backgrounds is that they tend to live somewhat more separately from the mainstream, both physically and in terms of social norms, and are two of the groups most likely to bring in spouses from their ancestral homes, especially the Pakistani group. This produces the so-called first generation in every generation issue, with full integration constantly being restrained by one parent with a foot in another country. Recommendation 19. Create agency. Undertake a Support for Families review. The Commission recommends that the Government undertakes a Support for Families review to further investigate issues highlighted by this Commission as follows. Collecting data about family strain in different ethnic groups. Academic research into cultural attitudes and parenting styles, which may be distinct within ethnic communities, and what role they play in shaping life outcomes. The impact of employment and working practices on parenting outcomes in different ethnic groups. More complex understandings of fatherhood in different ethnic groups that analyses similarities and differences and reasons for variance. The role of culture and religion in family outcomes. The review should also look to develop a series of actions on education, how early years settings and schools can provide better support services for parents and the potential role of school-parent contracts in helping build relations between schools and parents. Employment. Encouraging employers to look at flexible working for single parents. Crime and policing. How parents can be involved and supported to prevent youth crime, including potential for increased interactions between police and parents during the out-of-court disposal processes. Health. Mental health services encouraging more family therapy and group support in the event of family breakdown, which may disproportionately benefit ethnic minority groups. Quote, I welcome the Commission's focus on the importance of supporting parents and families right from the early years, so that children can get the very best start in life and the support they need to thrive as they grow up. End quote. Dame Rachel de Souza, DBE, Children's Commissioner of England. The Children's Commissioner of England should be a part of the review team to ensure the experiences and interests of children and young people are taken into account. We note that the Children's Commissioner's Office has recently announced a new survey for children called The Big Ask. The findings of this survey should be considered as part of this work. What we think about race. What has been happening to beliefs about race and racism over recent years? There is now near universal acceptance that the UK is a multi-ethnic society, and people of immigrant backgrounds can be British. Polling conducted recently in 2020 by Ipsos Mori found 93% of Britons disagree that to be truly British you have to be white, up from 82% in 2006. Those who agree have declined from 10 to 3% over the last 14 years. Ipsos Mori also found in 2020 that 89% would be happy for their child to marry someone from another ethnic group, up from 75% in 2009. Despite this, people believe there remain tensions between ethnic groups. Ipsos Mori found that 69% say there is at least a fair amount of tension. In 2020, 1 in 5 say there is a great deal, but a slight improvement is registered since 2008, when 76% felt there was a fair amount of tension. Moreover, polling from Opinium found that rather than uniting the country against racism, 55% of adults believe that BLM protests have increased racial tension, including among 44% of ethnic minority Britons. Polling by British Future for the Commission found encouraging consensus in attitudes between ethnic groups, with the exception of perceptions on anti-black prejudice. 69% of black respondents saw a lot of prejudice against black people compared with just 44% of ethnic minority respondents overall. 30% of Indian respondents saw a lot of prejudice against black people, which was quite close to white respondents, 25%. Yet when asked about specific instances of discrimination, those numbers often shrink. Research by Policy Exchange based on the Citizenship Survey found that the majority of ethnic minority people considered themselves not to have been discriminated against in promotion or hiring in the last 5 years. Overall, just under 12% of ethnic minority people thought they'd been discriminated against, compared with just under 6% for white people. That figure rises to 18.2% for black Caribbean people and 14.9% for black African people. Racism is both real and socially constructed. Society has defined racism down to encompass attitudes and behaviours that would not have been considered racist in the past. This is one reason for the rising sensitivity, the language of microaggressions and safety, and stretching the meaning of racism without objective data to support it. There is also the question of the relative success of different groups. Those groups, particularly Indian and Chinese ethnic groups, who have the most success in British society, tend to see fewer obstacles and less prejudice. And those groups that do less well, black people and Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims, tend to see and experience more of both, though black African people are considerably more positive than black Caribbean people. 76% of black people believe that there is white privilege, compared with 59% of all ethnic minorities and 29% of white people. Almost as many white people are unfamiliar with the term, 21%. Almost exactly half of ethnic minority Britons do not think their race has been an obstacle to their personal advancement. Responding to the question, "Do you think your race has or has not directly prevented you from being able to succeed or pursue opportunities in your own personal life?" 40% of ethnic minority people said it has, and 38% said it has not. Despite this, a majority of ethnic minority Britons agree that race relations have improved over the last 50 years, and this view is held by 3 times as many people as those who believe race relations have got worse. The British Future polling suggests that there is no big divide on the things that most concern us between white and ethnic minority people, with race and class background seen as being of similar importance to life chances. To better assess how far the UK has become a multi-ethnic society at ease with itself, the Commission also wanted to compare developments in the UK with international experience. The minority rights group International, MRG, published a report in 2016 assessing the condition of minorities worldwide. It documented challenges and discrimination facing minorities in a broad and representative sample of countries. Issues ranged from socio-economic inequalities, economic marginalisation, and land disputes to cultural contestations, negative stereotyping, and prejudice in these states. These tensions show treating minorities fairly is a universal challenge, and one that the UK, in view of the Commission, manages comparatively well as a democratic state with a welfare system and robust anti-discrimination laws. Another study in 2019 by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights on being black in the EU revealed the percentage of black respondents who experienced racial harassment in the past 5 years. The figure was 63% in Finland, 52% in Luxembourg, 51% in Ireland, 48% in both Germany and Italy, and 41% in both Sweden and Denmark. In comparison, 21% of black British respondents reported such harassment, the second lowest result in the countries surveyed. The UK had the lowest figure for black respondents who experienced discrimination in job seeking, education either themselves or as parents, health, housing, public administration, or other public or private services such as restaurants, bars, or shops within the past 12 months. Although the continued presence of discrimination gives cause for concern, it is important to see how the UK has improved race relations more rapidly than other countries. The fact that the UK is more active in collecting data on ethnicity and discrimination suggests a willingness to address racial inequalities compared with the rest of Europe, where data gathering is less comprehensive, ad hoc, or even illegal. Yet, despite the UK comparing well internationally, there is still a powerful current of unease and even anger that bubbled up in last summer's BLM protests. Minorities, even after several generations, often feel a detachment and unease relative to the majorities, and tend to remain sensitive to their group's relative status in the society. Notwithstanding that we have argued about the relative openness of British society, the Commission accepts the scholarly consensus that a psychological asymmetry, unavoidable, characterises majority-minority relations across different cultures, including in the UK. Younger ethnic minority people in the UK may identify more strongly with their ethnicity and heritage than older generations, reflecting a new desire to adopt multiple identities rather than to assimilate. This needs to be understood and factored into ongoing British race relations strategies. Strong ethnic identities should also not be considered in and of themselves as an inherent obstacle to British nation building. People are evidently capable of juggling multiple identities in their everyday lives. What matters is for the British identity to evoke positive emotions of trust and affection in the country's minorities. In the UK, the best way to build trust is to emphasise to every ethnic group that we treat individuals fairly and not on the basis of their ethnicity. We respect ethnic identities but also share a common unifying civil identity as British citizens. We must continually reflect on how to reinforce the symbols of Britishness, which signal to minorities that they are considered full members of the British family, while retaining their own distinctive identities.